Sexuality must not be described as a stubborn drive, by nature alien and of necessity disobedient to a power which exhausts itself trying to subdue it and often fails to control it entirely. It appears rather as an especially dense transfer point for relations of power, between men and women, young people and old people, parents and offspring, teachers and students, priests and laity, and administration and population. Sexuality is not the most intractable element in power relations, but rather one of those endowed with the greatest instrumentality, useful for the greatest number of maneuvers and capable of serving as a point of support, as a linchpin, for the most varied strategies. There is no single, all-encompassing strategy, valid for all of society and uniformly bearing on all the manifestations of sex. For example, the idea that there have been repeated attempts, by various means, to reduce all of sex to its reproductive function, its heterosexual and adult form, and its matrimonial legitimacy fails to take into account the manifold objectives aimed for, the manifold means employed in the different sexual politics concerned with the two sexes, the different age groups and social classes. In a first approach to the problem, it seems that we can distinguish four great strategic unities which, beginning in the 18th century, formed specific mechanisms of knowledge and power centering on sex. These did not come into being fully developed at that time, but it was then that they took on a consistency and gained an effectiveness in the order of power, as well as a productivity in the order of knowledge, so that it is possible to describe them in their relative autonomy. A hysterization of women's bodies, a threefold process whereby the feminine body was analyzed, qualified, and disqualified as being thoroughly saturated with sexuality, whereby it was integrated into the sphere of medical practices, by reason of pathology intrinsic to it, whereby, finally, it was placed in organic communication with the social body, whose regulated fecundity it was supposed to ensure, the family space, of which it had to be a substantial and functional element, and the life of children, which it produced and had to guarantee, by virtue of a biological moral responsibility lasting through the entire period of the children's education. The mother, with her negative image of nervous woman, constituted the most visible form of this hysterization. 2. Pedagogization of children's sex, a double assertion that practically all children indulge or are prone to indulge in sexual activity, and that, being unwarranted, at the same time natural and contrary to nature, this sexual activity posed physical and moral, individual, and collective dangers. Children were defined as preliminary sexual beings, on this side of sex, yet within it, astride a dangerous dividing line. Parents, families, educators, doctors, and eventually psychologists would have to take charge, in a continuous way, of this precious and perilous, dangerous, and endangered sexual potential. This pedagogization was especially evident in the war against onanism, which in the West lasted nearly 2 centuries. 3. A socialization of procreative behavior, an economic socialization by all the incitements and restrictions, the social and fiscal measures brought to bear on the fertility of couples, a political socialization achieved through the responsibilization of couples with regard to the social body as a whole, which had to be limited or on the contrary reinvigorated, and a medical socialization carried out by attributing a pathogenic value for the individual and the species to birth control practices. 4. A psychiatrization of perverse pleasure, the sexual instinct was isolated as a separate biological and psychical instinct. A clinical analysis was made of all the forms of anomalies by which it could be afflicted. It was assigned a role of normalization or pathologization with respect to all behavior, and finally, a corrective technology was sought for these anomalies. 4 figures emerged from this preoccupation with sex, which mounted throughout the 19th century. 4 privileged objects of knowledge, which were also targets and anchorage points for the ventures of knowledge: the hysterical woman, the masturbating child, the malvision couple, and the perverse adult. Each of them corresponded to one of these strategies which, each in its own way, invested and made use of the sex of women, children, and men. What was at issue in these strategies? A struggle against sexuality? Or were they part of an effort to gain control of it? An attempt to regulate it more effectively and mask its more indiscreet, conspicuous, and intractable aspects? A way of formulating only that measure of knowledge about it that was acceptable or useful? In actual fact, what was involved, rather, was the very production of sexuality. Sexuality must not be thought of as a kind of natural given which power tries to hold in check, or as an obscure domain which knowledge tries gradually to uncover. It is the name that can be given to a historical construct, not a furtive reality that is difficult to grasp, but a great surface network in which the stimulation of bodies, the intensification of pleasures, the incitement to discourse, the formation of special knowledges, the strengthening of controls and resistances, are linked to one another, in accordance with a few major strategies of knowledge and power. It will be granted no doubt that relations of sex gave rise, in every society, to a deployment of alliance, a system of marriage, of fixation, and development of kinship ties, of transmission of names and possessions. This deployment of alliance, with the mechanisms of constraint that ensured its existence and the complex knowledge it often required, lost some of its importance as economic processes and political structures could no longer rely on it as an adequate instrument or sufficient support. Particularly from the 18th century onward, Western societies created and deployed a new apparatus which was superimposed on the previous one, and which, without completely supplanting the latter, helped to reduce its importance. I am speaking of the deployment of sexuality. Like the deployment of alliance, it connects up with the circuit of sexual partners, but in a completely different way. The two systems can be contrasted term by term. The deployment of alliance is built around a system of rules, defining the permitted and the forbidden, the licit and the illicit, whereas the deployment of sexuality operates according to mobile, polymorphous, and contingent techniques of power. The deployment of alliance has as one of its chief objectives to reproduce the interplay of relations and maintain the law that governs them. The deployment of sexuality, on the other hand, engenders a continual extension of areas and forms of control. For the first, what is pertinent is the link between partners and definite statutes. The second is concerned with the sensations of the body, the quality of pleasures, and the nature of impressions, however tenuous or imperceptible these may be. Lastly, if the deployment of alliance is firmly tied to the economy due to the role it can play in the transmission or circulation of wealth, the deployment of sexuality is linked to the economy through numerous and subtle relays, the main one of which, however, is the body that produces and consumes. In a word, the deployment of alliance is attuned to a homeostasis of the social body, which it has the function of maintaining, whence its privileged link with the law, whence to the fact that the important phase for it is reproduction. The deployment of sexuality has its reason for being, not in reproducing itself, but in proliferating, innovating, annexing, creating, and penetrating bodies in an increasingly detailed way, and in controlling populations in an increasingly comprehensive way. We are compelled, then, to accept 3 or 4 hypotheses which run counter to the one on which the theme of a sexuality repressed by the modern forms of society is based. Sexuality is tied to recent devices of power. It has been expanding at an increasing rate since the 17th century. The arrangement that has sustained it is not governed by Reproduction, it has been linked from the outset with an intensification of the body with its exploitation as an object of knowledge and an element in relations of power. It is not exact to say that the deployment of sexuality supplanted the deployment of alliance. One can imagine that one day it will have replaced it. But as things stand at present, while it does tend to cover up the deployment of alliance, it has neither obliterated the latter nor rendered it useless. Moreover, historically it was around and on the basis of the deployment of alliance that the deployment of sexuality was constructed. First the practice of penance, then that of the examination of conscience and spiritual direction, was the formative nucleus, as we have seen. What was at issue to begin with at the tribunal of penance was sex insofar as it was the basis of relations. The questions posed had to do with the commerce allowed or forbidden, adultery, extramarital relations, relations with a person prohibited by blood or statute, the legitimate or illegitimate character of the act of sexual Congress. Then, coinciding with the new pastoral and its application in seminaries, secondary schools, and convents, there was a gradual progression away from the problematic of relations toward a problematic of the flesh, that is, of the body, sensation, the nature of pleasure, the more secret forms of enjoyment or acquiescence. Sexuality was taking shape, born of a technology of power that was originally focused on alliance. Since then, it has not ceased to operate in conjunction with the system of alliance on which it has depended for support. The family cell, in the form in which it came to be valued in the course of the 18th century, made it possible for the main elements of the deployment of sexuality, the feminine body, infantile precocity, the regulation of births, and to a lesser extent no doubt, the specification of the perverted, to develop along its two primary dimensions, the husband-wife axis and the parents-children axis. The family, in its contemporary form, must not be understood as a social, economic, and political structure of alliance that excludes or at least restrains sexuality, that diminishes it as much as possible, preserving only its useful functions. On the contrary, its role is to anchor sexuality and provide it with a permanent support. It ensures the protection of a sexuality that is not homogeneous with the privileges of alliance, while making it possible for the systems of alliance to be imbued with a new tactic of power which they would otherwise be impervious to. The family is the interchange of sexuality and alliance. It conveys the law and the juridical dimension in the deployment of sexuality, and it conveys the economy of pleasure and the intensity of sensations in the regime of alliance. This interpenetration of the deployment of alliance and that of sexuality in the form of the family allows us to understand a number of facts, that since the 18th century the family has become an obligatory locus of affects, feelings, love, that sexuality has its privileged point of development in the family, that for this reason sexuality is incestuous from the start. It may be that in societies where the mechanisms of alliance predominate, prohibition of incest is a functional indispensable rule. But in a society such as ours, where the family is the most active side of sexuality, and where it is doubtless the exigencies of the latter which maintain and prolong its existence, incest for different reasons altogether and in a completely different way occupies a central place. It is constantly being solicited and refused. It is an object of obsession and attraction, a dreadful secret and an indispensable pivot. It is manifested as a thing that is strictly forbidden in the family insofar as the latter functions as a deployment of alliance, but it is also a thing that is continuously demanded in order for the family to be a hotbed of constant sexual incitement. If for more than a century the West has displayed such a strong interest in the prohibition of incest, if more or less by common accord it has been seen as a social universal and one of the points through which every society is obliged to pass on the way to becoming a culture, perhaps this is because it was found to be a means of self-defense, not against an incestuous desire, but against the expansion and the implications of this deployment of sexuality which had been set up, but which, among its many benefits, had the disadvantage of ignoring the laws and juridical forms of alliance. By asserting that all societies without exception, and consequently our own, were subject to this rule of rules, one guaranteed that this deployment of sexuality, whose strange effects were beginning to be felt among them, the effect of intensification of the family space, would not be able to escape from the grand and ancient system of alliance. Thus the law would be secure, even in the new mechanics of power. For this is the paradox of a society which, from the 18th century to the present, has created so many technologies of power that are foreign to the concept of law. It fears the effects and proliferations of those technologies and attempts to recode them in forms of law. If one considers the threshold of all culture to be prohibited incest, then sexuality has been, from the dawn of time, under the sway of law and right. By devoting so much effort to an endless reworking of the transcultural theory of the incest taboo, anthropology has proved worthy of the whole modern deployment of sexuality and the theoretical discourses it generates. What has taken place since the 17th century can be interpreted in the following manner. The deployment of sexuality which first developed on the fringes of familial institutions, in the direction of conscience and pedagogy, for example, gradually became focused on the family, the alien, irreducible, and even perilous effects it held in store for the deployment of alliance, and awareness of this danger was evidenced in the criticism often directed at the indiscretion of the directors, and in the entire controversy, which O.C. heard somewhat later, over the private or public, institutional, or familial education of children too, were absorbed by the family, a family that was reorganized, restricted no doubt, and in any case intensified in comparison with the functions it formerly exercised in the deployment of alliance. In the family, parents and relatives became the chief agents of a deployment of sexuality which drew its outside support from doctors, educators, and later psychiatrists, and which began by competing with the relations of alliance but soon psychologized or psychiatrized the latter. Then these new personages made their appearance, the nervous woman, the frigid wife, the indifferent mother or worse, the mother beset by murderous obsessions, the impotent, sadistic, perverse husband, the hysterical or neurasthenic girl, the precocious and already exhausted child, and the young homosexual who rejects marriage or neglects his wife. These were the combined figures of an alliance gone bad and an abnormal sexuality. They were the means by which the disturbing factors of the latter were brought into the former. And yet they also provided an opportunity for the alliance system to assert its prerogatives in the order of sexuality. Then a pressing demand emanated from the family, a plea for help in reconciling these unfortunate conflicts between sexuality and alliance, and, caught in the grip of this deployment of sexuality which had invested it from without, contributing to its solidification into its modern form, the family broadcast the long complaint of its sexual suffering to doctors, educators, psychiatrists, priests, and pastors, to all the experts who would listen. It was as if it had suddenly discovered the dreadful secret of what had always been hinted at and inculcated in it. The family, the keystone of alliance, was the germ of all the misfortunes of sex. And lo and behold, from the mid-19th century onward, the family engaged in searching out the slightest traces of sexuality in its midst, wrenching from itself the most difficult confessions, soliciting an audience with everyone who might know something about the matter, and opening itself unreservedly to endless examination. The family was the crystal in the deployment of sexuality. It seemed to be the source of a sexuality which it actually only reflected and diffracted. By virtue of its permeability, and through that process of reflections to the outside, it became one of the most valuable tactical components of the deployment. But this development was not without its tensions and problems. Charcot doubtless constituted a central figure in this as well. For many years he was the most noteworthy of all those to whom families, burdened down as they were with the sexuality that saturated them, appealed for mediation and treatment. On receiving parents who brought him their children, husbands their wives, and wives their husbands, from the world over, his first concern was to separate the patient from his family, and the better to observe him, he would pay as little attention as possible to what the family had to say. Point 3. He sought to detach the sphere of sexuality from the system of alliance, in order to deal with it directly through a medical practice whose technicity and autonomy were guaranteed by the neurological model. Medicine thus assumed final responsibility, according to the rules of specific knowledge, for a sexuality which it had in fact urged families to concern themselves with as an essential task and a major danger. Moreover, Charcot noted on several occasions how difficult it was for families to yield the patient whom they nonetheless had brought to the doctor, how they laid siege to the mental hospitals where the subject was being kept out of view, and the ways in which they were constantly interfering with the doctor's work. Their worry was unwarranted, however. The therapist only intervened in order to return to them individuals who were sexually compatible with the family system, and while this intervention manipulated the sexual body, it did not authorize the latter to define itself in explicit discourse. One must not speak of these genital causes, so went the phrase muttered in a muted voice which the most famous ears of our time overheard one day in 1886, from the mouth of Charcot. This was the context in which psychoanalysis set to work, but not without substantially modifying the pattern of anxieties and reassurances. In the beginning it must have given rise to distrust and hostility, for, pushing Charcot's lesson to the extreme, it undertook to examine the sexuality of individuals outside family control. It brought the sexuality to light without covering it over again with the neurological model. More serious still, it called family relations into question in the analysis it made of them. But despite everything, psychoanalysis, whose technical procedure seemed to place the confession of sexuality outside family jurisdiction, Reedy's covered the law of alliance, the involved workings of marriage and kinship, and incest at the heart of the sexuality, as the principle of its formation and the key to its intelligibility. The guarantee that one would find the parents-children relationship at the root of everyone's sexuality made it possible even when everything seemed to point to the reverse process to keep the deployment of sexuality coupled to the system of alliance. There was no risk that sexuality would appear to be, by nature, alien to the law. It was constituted only through the law. Parents, do not be afraid to bring your children to analysis. It will teach them that in any case it is you whom they love. Children, you really shouldn't complain that you are not orphans, that you always rediscover in your innermost selves your object mother or the sovereign sign of your father. It is through them that you gain access to desire. Whence, after so many reticences, the enormous consumption of analysis in societies where the deployment of alliance and the family system needed strengthening. For this is one of the most significant aspects of this entire history of the deployment of sexuality. It had its beginnings in the technology of the fleshing classical Christianity, basing itself on the alliance system and the rules that govern the latter, but today it fills a reverse function in that it tends to prop up the old deployment of alliance. From the direction of conscience to psychoanalysis, the deployments of alliance and sexuality were involved in a slow process that had them turning about one another until, more than 3 centuries later, their positions were reversed. In the Christian pastoral, the law of alliance codified the flesh which was just being discovered and fitted it into a framework that was still juridical in character. With psychoanalysis, sexuality gave body and life to the rules of alliance by saturating them with desire. Hence the domain we must analyze in the different studies that will follow the present volume is that deployment of sexuality, its formation on the basis of the Christian notion of the flesh, and its development through the 4 great strategies that were deployed in the 19th century, the sexualization of children, the hysterization of women, the specification of the perverted, and the regulation of populations, all strategies that went by way of a family which must be viewed, not as a powerful agency of prohibition, but as a major factor of sexualization. The first phase corresponded to the need to form a labor force, hence to avoid any useless expenditure, any wasted energy, so that all forces were reduced to labor capacity alone, and to ensure its reproduction, conjugality, the regulated fabrication of children. The second phase corresponded to that epoch of spat capitalism in which the exploitation of wage labor does not demand the same violent and physical constraints as in the 19th century, and where the politics of the body does not require the elision of sex or its restriction solely to the reproductive function. It relies instead on a multiple channeling into the controlled circuits of the economy on what has been called the hyper-repressive desublimation. If the politics of sex makes little use of the law of the taboo but brings into play an entire technical machinery, if what is involved is the production of sexuality rather than the repression of sex, then our emphasis has to be placed elsewhere. We must shift our analysis away from the problem of labor capacity and doubtless abandon the diffuse energetics that underlies the theme of a sexuality repressed for economic reasons.